before we get into the next few talks, I wanted to mention something quickly because it's been a couple of people have asked me about it. Shuttles will start after the last session from here to Little America and run all night, so all the way through the after party and everything, and bring people home. So if you had questions about that, yeah, we'll have vans running all the time. I am going to they will be wherever they were this morning. Where were they this morning? Anybody know? Just right down here? Just the bottom of the stairs here, yeah? Okay, yeah. So they'll pick up and drop off there. We have another message from one of our sponsors. Dennis is here from Automatic. They are another one of our platinum sponsors. They are responsible for making the workshop day happen yesterday. So thanks to Automatic. And now we're gonna let Dennis talk for just a minute, and then we'll move on to our session with Natalie and Nathan.
Thanks, Ryan. If anybody here is not familiar with Automatic, you've probably seen some of our products. We make WordPress.com, the Jetpack plugin, SimpleNote, WooCommerce, Gravatar, and a lot of others. You may not know that we're a 100% distributed company with over 500 employees spread out over 55 different countries, and we're constantly hiring, looking for people who want to make the web a better place. We've got our booth over next door, and we've got lots of goodies that we want to give away. If you're interested, just swing over and chat with us. You may also not be familiar with our VIP platform, which is a partnership that we enter into with our customers who have really high performance demands, really high uptime demands, really complicated WordPress needs. We like to provide that expertise and service level that not too many other agencies can provide. Anyway, thank you for attending here, and I'll turn it back over.
All right, thanks, Dennis, and thanks again, Automatic. I am now going to introduce. This is a special treat because we have two speakers on stage for this next session. Nathan Tyler is from Los Angeles, California, is from Los Angeles, California. He has an agency called Tyler Digital. He's an automation specialist. He does a lot of really interesting things. A project he's been working on lately is called Staging Pilot. It's automated maintenance for your WordPress websites, so definitely take a chance to check that out. And the other thing you should all know about Nathan is he is extremely opinionated about Girl Scout cookies. So tonight at the after party, hit him up about that, have a conversation around that. And then also, I want to introduce Natalie. Natalie MacLees is also the owner of an agency, Purple Pen Productions. She is a UI designer and web developer, and she also leads the Girl Develop It chapter of Los Angeles. And we're so happy to have them both here. They're going to talk about React. So Natalie, Nathan, the time is yours.
Hey.
Thank you.
Hi.
Everyone,
This
is
our
first
joint.
presentation.
I'm
Nathan,
and
I'm.
Natalie. Okay, so we're going to split the talk time exactly evenly, but I think we're going to just scrap that.
No, I think we could stick with it.
Yeah.
No, the whole time.
Okay.
So a few months ago, Nathan and I decided to we've built one plugin together, and we decided to build another one. And we decided we wanted to use React. And we thought, we're two smart people, how hard can it be? We'll learn it in a day or two, have the plugin done in a month. But then we very quickly found out that you can't just learn React. There's this whole ecosystem of other things that you have to learn as well. So we'll be stepping you through all of that and sharing our knowledge with you in this talk. But first, Nathan, I think we have to tell everybody, what is React?
That's a great question, Natalie. React is a JavaScript framework created by Facebook.
A framework like jQuery?
Similar. You use React to implement interactive user interfaces, and you would put all your code into components, so it's reusable and isolated, And React also is very efficient, so it performs very fast, especially on larger applications. Do you have any other questions, Natalie?
Yeah, but what's a component?
Another great question, thank you. A component could be used for anything. You could use it for a larger scale application. For this example, we're just going to choose something really small. You could use a component just to do simple license activation within your plugin. So this is something that you could do with just raw jQuery and do it the old way, or you could use React. Okay, so and if you're using jQuery the old way, you just output this text field and this button on the screen. When you would bind a click event to the activate license button, you click activate license, and then you say show the loading spinner, maybe deactivate the button, deactivate the text box, wait for the AJAX response to come back, parse the response, and then if it's successful, you would hide the button, hide the text field. So all of these things, you're doing explicit manipulations to the DOM. This is probably what you're familiar with doing. On something this small of scale, it works pretty well. If you start building up a whole application, it gets pretty complicated quickly. And so, yeah, because if you have a failure with the license activation, then you're going to have trouble. Like you have to put all that code in the AJAX response. When you're parsing the response, you have to put the branches for like, if this is the result, then modify these elements. It gets convoluted. So with React, it's simpler. So you have a single render function, and you have a state. So for this, it would be pretty simple. Like basically, we're tracking like, is it in the middle of loading? What is the license that's been entered? And is the license active? And from that, we know how to draw the HTML on screen. So if, like when we click the button, all we do is change the state to say that the loading is true. We know how to draw that. We just draw the spinner. When we get the response back, then we just change the loading false, and we can say whether the license is active, true or false, and we could draw out the final state. So it simplifies your code because you're not writing all these things in nested conditionals. You have a single function that you can debug, and it's a lot easier to work with as your states get more complicated. You're not ending up with all these different edge cases where if it ended up in some weird edge case, getting it back out, maybe you forgot to hide the spinner in some scenario. When you're pushing everything through the same render function, it's cleaner code and easier to maintain down the road. And it also has the benefit of performance, which you're not really going to see in that simple of an example, but basically what's happening on behind the scenes is React creates a virtual DOM, so everything, all the show events and hide events, all those things take place in their virtual DOM. So it's actually a JavaScript object. Nothing gets written to the browser until the end of the render function, and it does kind of a diff, so it compares like the state of the browser and then in the virtual DOM, and then it will only push over the differences. So if you're like showing 5 elements during your render function and then hiding them, you're doing a bunch of different changes at the end of that function, then it's only going to push the differences to the browser. So this happens a lot faster than if you were doing the individual events.
All right. The animation got a little behind yet.
Oh.
And each component has a life cycle, and there's different methods that are associated with each stage of the life cycle. And you can think of those as being very similar to WordPress actions and filters, in that they're places where you can hook into this life cycle to make modifications or override things. And this is a list of all of the different methods that are in the life cycle. Anything that has the verb will in it fires right before something happens. Anything with the verb did fires right after something happens. And then you'll notice that several of these refer to mounting, and that is the process of creating the component in that virtual DOM and assembling all of the different properties and values that are going to make up that component. And then rendering is the process of actually taking that virtual DOM object and pushing it to the UI and manipulating the DOM. And then unmounting is the process of actually removing that item from the UI and removing that, the existence of it from the application altogether.
Are all of those required?
No, I'm glad you asked, Nathan. only the render method is actually required. So that's the only one that you actually need to render a component to the DOM. All of the other ones are just optional if you need to go in and overwrite something. So one thing that Nathan and I realized pretty quickly when we started trying to learn React is that React is super flexible, and you can use it in a number of different ways. And all the different tutorials that we found online were all using different approaches, and it was super confusing because we had no idea, does this person even know what they're talking about? Like, we didn't even really know, like, which were the good tutorials and which were the bad, because everybody was saying something slightly different. We also came across just references to tons of workflow tools. So Browserify and Webpack and Babel and React.js and React Browserify and Vinyl Source Stream and all these different things, and we had no idea. Did we actually need any of these tools at all? And if so, which ones did we actually need to use? And we also found out that you technically don't need to use any of them, that you can take React.js and drop it into an HTML page just the way that you would with jQuery and write some code to use it. So like, was that the approach that we were supposed to be taking? We weren't really clear. So we, after much research and banging our head against the wall and being completely stalled out and full of angst about our project, we came down to finally realizing what were the best approaches and the best tools. And we're going to share those with you so that if you want to dive into building your first React project, we can save you all of those months of time that we wasted trying to get it all sorted out. So we're going to get started by talking about the tools that we've actually decided that we do need to use.
Okay, so NPM stands for Node Package Manager, and to install any of the tools that you're going to need, basically you're going to go into the command line, type npm install, and the package name. That'll download it. It'll install it in a directory called Node Modules. Node Modules contains approximately 3 trillion files, so you want to make sure that you git ignore that and it doesn't end up into your repository, because I think GitHub rejected our push at one point because we didn't do that. But what you do want to do, when you type the npm install, you want to do --save, which will add it to your package.json, which
And
is
why is that important?
Well, it's really important because hypothetically, if your coworker installs a bunch of packages, does a bunch of great code, but doesn't save and doesn't update package.json, then when I go to pull in the project, I don't get any of those libraries, and all my code no longer works.
Just hypothetically speaking.
Hypothetically.
None whatsoever.
No. Webpack is another tool that you're going to want to use with React. It has a lot of nice things bundled into it. So it acts as the web server. So you can go into your browser and go to localhost 8080. You can see the project that you're working on. It has a live reload functionality. So if you save your code, it'll reload in the browser. It also has something specific to React called hot module replacement. So it'll actually keep your state. So like in the license example, maybe you typed in a license key, you've already clicked activate. So you're in like kind of the third state of your app. If you change your code and hit save, it'll actually reload but keep that state so you don't have to go through all those steps again, which those are all small wins, but they add up when you're doing the development. It cuts down on your debug time. It also has like a proxy server built in, so if you're trying to connect to a REST API, like on your local server or a remote server, you can avoid a lot of the cross-origin request restrictions by using their proxy. So there's a lot of really handy stuff in there. There's tons more you can learn about Webpack, but definitely want to use it.
And do you have to be writing a React project to use Webpack?
No, you could use it for any other thing too.
Awesome. And then the final tool that we've decided on using is called Babel. And we're using Babel to do a couple of different things. The first is Babel will let you write EcmaScript 6, and it will translate it back into EcmaScript 5 that'll run in all the current browsers. But you get to write the latest, greatest EcmaScript 6 code. And we'll talk about that more a little bit later in the talk. And then the other thing that we're using Babel for is to transpile JSX.
Transpile is a technical term.
So JSX is a language that Facebook also brought out with React. And what it's really helpful for is when you're creating all these different elements with React, it can get really confusing to keep track of all this nested JavaScript. So JSX lets you actually write that in a way that looks very similar to HTML. So that's a sample of what it looks like up there. This is like a profile component that you would render out to the UI. A couple of important things to keep in mind is that you have to have one single parent container. So if you want to output multiple different items to the UI, you actually have to wrap those in some kind of a div or some other kind of HTML element. And then the other thing is, for the HTML attributes, you have to use the JavaScript names and not the names that you would normally use in HTML. So you can see on the image, I'm using a class, but I'm actually calling that class name like you would in JavaScript. And then Babel is able to take that JSX and output this JavaScript from it. And this is a relatively simple example, but you can see even with this, it's kind of difficult to figure out what's nested inside of what and make sure all the syntax is correct. So writing JSX is definitely way easier than trying to get that all sorted out and written neatly in your code. And then another thing that we hypothetically discovered is that there's a hidden file called .babelrc, which is Babel resource configuration, and that is necessary for Babel to actually work. So if you're refactoring your code and moving files around, it's a hidden file, so you won't necessarily see it in your file system. And then suddenly Babel won't work, and you might waste a couple of hours trying to figure out why. Just hypothetically.
Right. So everything we've talked about so far has been like front end, just drawing the HTML on the page, and that's a lot of what React is about. But presumably you want to hook it up to some kind of data source, communicate with your database, maybe a REST API endpoint. So we're going to cover a couple of the basic ways to do that. So the most basic and beginner-friendly way that you're going to want to start with is to take that pure component, which is what we did earlier, which basically it will take the state and properties that you pass to it, and it'll draw the HTML on the page. But it doesn't really have any knowledge about the database or any API endpoints, any kind of server communication. And then you create another component that sits around that is responsible for communicating with the server, doing an AJAX request, getting the new state, and then telling that pure component to redraw and take the new state. And so that's a nice clean separation of the responsibilities so that you can take that pure component, you could drop that license thing into any of your plugins or projects, and then you could just change the container component in which API endpoint it's communicating with. So there's a lot of tutorials that do more advanced things like this one, but that's definitely what you want to start with so that you're not overcomplicating things. Now, if you're doing something, if you have ambitions larger than a license activation component, then you're going to want to do something a little more advanced, and this could be a whole talk by itself, so we won't really dive into it, but you're not going to want to push your entire database, download the whole thing. When the page loads, you don't want to push the entire database up with just a tiny change. So there's lots of scenarios where you're going to want to pull small parts of the database and just push small changes and keep in sync with your server. Redux is a tool that's built around solving that problem. So there's Redux, Thunk, React Router. Those are all things that you'd want to get into further. And if you have questions about that, then find us afterwards.
Okay. And then one thing that we noticed is that if you're used to writing JavaScript, like just using jQuery and doing some DOM manipulations, that when you get into writing some React, you actually use some parts of JavaScript that you might not be super familiar with. So we're just going to step through what some of those things are. And first up, we're going to talk about objects and some things that you should know about objects. Objects have an assign method, and that can be used to merge objects together. If you're familiar with writing jQuery plugins, this is similar to the $.extend that you use to merge like your default settings with the settings passed to the plugin, or similar to array merge in PHP. So this is an example where I have a slider that I'm going to put on the page, and it's got a default settings object. And then I want to override one of those settings for this particular instance of the slider. So I'm going to create a new variable and use object.assign and pass in first an empty object, and then default settings. And then so default settings will now go into that empty object, and then I'll pass in my settings, and any of the properties and values that are different will overwrite what was in there before. So you can pass as many different objects as you like in there, and they're just going to go from left to right and be smushed all into one object, so that at the end you end up with a settings object with the result of the default settings being overridden by your settings.
If this is like array merge in PHP, why do you need that empty object at all?
Because JavaScript. So if we left that out, in this particular code, if we left out that empty object, we would actually overwrite default settings. So we would actually just merge my settings directly into default settings. And presumably, since it's a default settings object for whatever our slider is, you want to preserve that and not mutate it, and not change any of the values. So you're creating a new object by doing that. And the assign method can also be used to clone objects. So here I have a cat with a fuzzy face. And if I want a second one, because who doesn't want more cats, you can, okay, you don't have to raise your hand. You can do the assign method again, pass first an empty object, and then the object that you want to clone. And that'll create a clone of that original object. And now for functions, if you've worked with JavaScript functions, you know that every time you write a new function, it creates a new context for the this keyword. And that can get really crazy really quickly. So we're going to talk about a few of the different methods of JavaScript that help you to deal with that and make sure that this is exactly what you expect it to be. So first we have the bind method of a function. And this actually returns a new function to you with the this value set explicitly. So in this example, I have Nathan's cats, Chloe and Risa.
Actually, really important point of clarification, that those are my wife's cats.
Okay, I have Nathan's wife's cats, Chloe and Risa, and a function that will call the cats. And inside that function, I'm calling this.name and this.temperament to talk about those cats. So what I want to do to make sure that I always have the right cat is use the bind method to create two new functions, call Chloe and call Risa, and I'll just use bind to bind a specific object to that function so that when I use this inside those functions, it will be referring to the correct cat. And then similar to the bind method, call method, and the difference here is the call method actually invokes the function. So where bind returns a new function, call invokes the function. So again, I have Nathan's wife's cats. And this time I have a function to call them that actually takes an argument of a specific greeting that I want to use to call the cat. And how I would then use the call method is the function name.call, and then I'll pass to it first the value that I would like to be this inside that function. So I want to use this.name and this.temperament. So I'd pass in whichever object I wanted to be this. And then after that, I pass in a comma-separated list of arguments that would be passed to that function. So here, for the first one, it would call Chloe, and it would say, come here, Chloe, you friendly kitty. And then almost identical to call is the apply method. And the only difference between call and apply is that when you're passing the arguments for your function, for apply, you do it as an array. So you can see this code is almost identical to the last slide except the last two lines, where I'm using apply instead of call, and then I have square brackets wrapped around the arguments that I'm passing to the function so that those are an array. And it's easy to remember because comma and call both start with C, and apply and array both start with A, so you can keep them straight.
Speaking of arrays, is there anything else we should know about arrays?
Is there? Well, yes, I think there is. Great question, Nathan. So the first thing that you want to know about arrays is the map method. And the map method leaves your original array alone and creates a new array. And it have the same number of items as the original array, but the individual items in the array will be the result of running a particular function on each of those items. So in this example, I have an array of 6 numbers, and then I'm going to call the map method to multiply each of those numbers by 5. So whatever value you return from that callback function is what the new item for that new array will be. So the result of this is my numbers times 5 array, which has 6 numbers that are those original numbers, each multiplied by 5. And this is useful for doing something where you've got a list of items that you want to be pushing out to a React component, and maybe you want to wrap a paragraph around each one or a list item around each one. So that can be really helpful for that. And then arrays also have a filter method, which again leaves your original array alone and creates a new array. And the callback function in this case will return a Boolean value. And if it's true, then the item will be copied to the new array. If it's false, then the item will be skipped. So here I have an array of cats, because if you didn't know, by the way, if you don't know Nathan, his most favorite things in the world are JavaScript and cats.
In that order. Yep.
So I've got an array of cats from all different countries around the world, and I want to filter that down to just the cats that are from Japan. So I can call the cat.filter method and just return a Boolean on whether or not the country is equal to Japan, and my new array, cats from Japan, will be just the 2 cats that are from Japan. Now we're going to dive into the super cool kid stuff, EcmaScript 6. As you'll find in React tutorials, the React community has really embraced EcmaScript 6. And you need to have kind of a background knowledge of it to be able to look at these tutorials and understand what's going on. So first up, we have a few new ways of declaring variables. So var has been in JavaScript forever. And we just use the var keyword to declare a variable with that. And if you're outside of a function, your variable will have global scope. If you're inside of a function, then it's scoped to just that function. So we're all used to that, but we have a couple of new things in EcmaScript 6. So first we have let, which works very similarly to var, except it has block scope. Brand new in JavaScript. We've never had block scope before. We've only had global or function. So now we have let, which will do a block scope. And we also have const. So we can define constants in JavaScript now. And that'll create a read-only reference to a value. And the scope of that constant depends on the context in which you define it. So if it's outside of anything, it'll have global scope. It could also have block scope, or it could have function scope. And it's important to note that that value is not immutable. So if your constant is an object, you can actually change the values of properties of that object, even though it's a constant. And then another thing that we kept seeing in React tutorials and had no clue what was going on was something we looked up and found is called the object literal property value shorthand. It's like a really long name for a really short thing. So if you're creating an object using an object literal, and your name and your property are the same, you actually don't have to type them out twice. So in this case, I'm creating a variable where I'm passing in name and color, and I want the property names to be the same. So before I would have to type name colon name and colon colon color, and now I could just type name comma color, and EcmaScript 6 is smart enough to figure out exactly what I'm talking about. And you'll see that in React tutorials all the time, and no one ever explains what's going on. And then we have modules in JavaScript, which is great because it helps make your code a lot more maintainable and maximizes reusability. So they're individual files where you can write a set of code, and now you can easily move that one file to other projects to reuse it again. And they're especially helpful for working with React because we are working with this component ecosystem. Every individual module can be a component, and then it's really easy to work with them and move a component between projects or use them in other places. So the way that you want to set up modules is each one is its own individual JavaScript file, and then at the bottom of the file, you need to export so that items in that file are available elsewhere. So here I'm creating a math utilities object and doing just a single default export. So there's 2 ways you can export things from modules. The first is to do a single default export, and that looks like this. So I define whatever my object is that I want to export, and then at the bottom of the file say export default and the name of the item that I'm exporting from that file. You can also do multiple named exports. So in this case, I'm exporting actually 3 things from this module. When you're working with React, you'll find it probably a lot more helpful to use most of the time the default named export, because if you're cramming multiple components into a module, you're kind of defeating the whole purpose of being able to use modules. But if it's a set of related functionality or something, then it might make sense to do the export or the multiple named exports. So once you have your modules set up and exported, when you're ready to use them, you just have to import them at the top of the file. So in your new file, if it's a named export, you just wrap the name in curly brackets, and that looks like the first example there. If it's just a default export, you don't have to wrap the name in curly brackets. You can just import it. And now that module is available for use inside that file.
So what the heck is ... That shows up in a lot of tutorials, and I've Googled it, but it's not very helpful.
Yeah. So that's another thing that you'll see in tons of React tutorials and never explained. And we did a bunch of research and figured out it's actually two different things. So keeping with the tradition of JavaScript being as confusing as possible, it's actually two different types of operators. The first thing it does is it's a REST operator. And what it'll do is collect up all of the arguments passed to a function as an array. So here's an example where I'm passing a series of fruits to a function, and then I'm collecting those up as ... fruits, so they'll be available as an array inside my function. Now, this is technically kind of possible with EcmaScript 5, because there's the arguments object available inside functions, but if you've ever tried to work with it, it gets really weird, because it's kind of like an array, but not really an array, and then when you have nested functions and closures, it gets really confusing really quickly, trying to keep track. So this is actually a little bit nicer because it's actually an array and it behaves just like an array, so it's very predictable. It can also be used to just collect up the rest of the arguments passed to a function. So here I have a function called best fruit, and I'm just passing a bunch of fruits to it and calling out the first fruit as the best one, and then however many other fruits I pass to that function, I'm just going to collect those all up in an array called other fruits. And then the ... is also the spread operator, which is mostly helpful for constructing arrays from other arrays. So here I have an array of red fruits and an array of yellow fruits, and then I want to create a new array with just all of those fruits in it. So I would do that by doing my square brackets for the all, and then ... red and ... yellow. So it's a little bit counterintuitive because you might think that's an array of arrays, but it's actually not, because the spread operator actually kind of makes everything one level array instead of gathering it up as separate arrays. And then my favorite new feature of EcmaScript 6 is arrow functions, which I actually hated them at first and thought they were completely unnecessary, but now I really like them. So they're especially useful in cases where you have a callback function where you're passing just a few arguments and you want to return some kind of value from them. So in this example, I'm using the map method, passing in a function. In EcmaScript 5, I have to type out function, my arguments, my curly brackets, I have to type the word return, and then return whatever value I want to. With arrow functions in EcmaScript 6, I can actually just type the argument or arguments I'm passing to my function, the arrow, and then that thing that I want to return. So it saves a lot of typing, so it's a nice shorthand. But arrow functions aren't just a direct shorthand for writing callback functions. They actually behave a little bit differently. So they don't create their own context. So here we have an example where we've got a method nested inside of an object, and we're using this.age. And because this is an arrow function, it won't create its own this context. So this.age will actually correctly get the age of the person object. And then finally, we have classes in EcmaScript 6, but not actually. So under the hood, JavaScript is still using good old prototypal inheritance instead of true classes. But we have this new syntax, which is just syntactic sugar, which makes it a little easier to understand what's going on. If you've ever tried to work directly with prototypal inheritance, that code is not the easiest to write or the easiest to read and understand. So this is much better. And I think also better for somebody who's coming from another language like PHP, where you actually have classes. This is something that you can be a little bit more comfortable and more familiar with.
Okay, so that was a lot of JavaScript.
Your favorite.
Right. And it's probably something you're going to come back to. We'll post the slides online. You'll be able to go back through all those. Hopefully, if you decide to tackle React, all that stuff is very useful. But we wanted to boil it down to a few takeaways, like if you are actually wanting to take on React, where can you start? So the first thing is identifying the tutorials that you want to work with, well, and what you need to get ready to do. So EcmaScript 6 is basically a requirement. I mean, it's nice because of all the different things we just outlined, but a lot of the tutorials are all written with ES6. Everybody in the React community is pretty fancy. So
It's a very fancy crowd.
yeah, everybody uses ES6. And if you find any tutorials that are using like Browserify or Grunt or Gulp, we'd recommend like looking for one that uses NPM and Webpack. When we found those, like we spent a lot of time trying to set up our environment and our workflow and the different JavaScript packages, whereas the setup with NPM and Webpack is much simpler. So if you want to just focus on trying to learn React, maybe cut that out of the equation. You can find some tutorials that are a little easier to get started with. When we were starting to look, there were a couple other libraries, React.js and Reactify, which were being used to take the JSX and do that transpiling step. Babel didn't used to do all of that, and now it does. So they might be slightly older tutorials if they're referencing those. And then you don't have to mess with those tools. Just find one that uses Babel to do the transpiling as well. And then any references to Flux, which isn't something we've really talked about, that's anything to do with the data layer. So anything that, like that pure component, container component model or Redux, that's the Flux layer that is communicating with the server. So we'd recommend the container component. It's the easiest way to get started. Just do an Ajax command and update your state so you can focus on learning React. And then if you're ready to go on to something bigger, then definitely look into Redux.
And we have many, many slides at the end of this presentation that are all the resources that we found particularly helpful. So we'll both tweet out a link to the slides that we'll put up online so that you can easily get all of these different links. But I think we did want to call out the first resource on this list, which is a book called Pro React by Casio de Souza Antonio. It's an excellent book. And it was just such a huge help for us. That's kind of our breakthrough point where we quit hitting our heads against the wall and actually started making progress and learning React. So each chapter of the book teaches you like a new concept of React, and you build a little app with it. But then also continuously through the book, you're also working on this other app chapter by chapter that starts out really simple and gets progressively more complex as you work through the book. So you kind of get both sides of that experience. It was just a really great book, and it's got an associated Git repo that the author is keeping up to date as new things happen with React. So it was super, super helpful, and probably the clearest and most easy to understand tutorial on getting Webpack and NPM set up as well. So I wasn't kidding, there's tons of slides. So 2 slides on React resources, 1 slide on the JavaScript things to brush up on, and then 2 slides on EcmaScript 6. So we'll share those online so that you can have access to all of those. These were the resources that we definitely found the most helpful for us as we were going through. And this is where you can find us both online and our Twitter handles so you can get the links to the slides. Thank you very much.